Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. So you might be wondering what's going on with all these parts here on the bench. I know I'd mentioned that I was going to get a Ted Weber kit for a Princeton Reverb before, and this is not that. This is actually my first attempt at scratch building an amp. I've got parts that have been sourced from a bunch of different projects that I've had in the past, and some things that I bought new. And we'll go through where everything came from as we build this thing. But basically this is going to be a Fender Champ style build. A pretty simple single 6V6 and 12AX7. Really low wattage, really straightforward, nothing fancy and no effects. This is going to be a multi-part series, and I'm going to wait till the very end to post the schematic for this build. But I have been doing kind of a layout on a piece of paper, and I'll tell you why that is, but it was basically so that I could start to buy some of the parts that you see here in the episode. Now this isn't a final draft of my layout, but I did want to show you where I've started. I started with an AA764 Fender Champ schematic or layout. I did modify the Champ schematic just a little bit. The main modifications are that I'm not using a CAN capacitor. I'm using capacitors here on a board. I'm also adding a mid-tone control to the tone section, and I'm using a completely different rectifier tube. I started out with a power transformer from a Newcomb radio chassis. It's an older chassis that was an old AM/FM radio. This power transformer powered a single EL84 or 6BQ5 tube and a complement of smaller tubes. Because of that, I think this 6X4 will handle this load just fine, and I know I've seen this set up in other amps like from Silvertone. At any rate, this is a pretty convenient setup to use when you don't have a 5-volt winding in your power transformer, and this one definitely doesn't. As far as where all of these components are located inside this layout, I did a little test fitting on paper first before I ordered anything, and like I said, I may move some of this around as we start the build. Although I'll say it is a pretty cramped layout already, and I'll probably not move anything very much. Anyway, I don't want to focus on this for now. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, and let's talk about some of the parts that I ordered to start this build. So most, but not all of the amp work I've done before has been on older Fenders, and I have a pretty big stash of capacitors and resistors. And most everything I have is designed to fit on a fiber board that would come in a standard hand-wired Fender amp. And so the first thing that I started looking for were my fiber board options, and I ended up choosing this fiber board equivalent. And it's actually kind of a rigid PCB style board, although there are no connections between any of these little eyelets on here. But what I really liked about this thing is that you can basically design your own circuit in place here, and you got a little, flexibility with this center row here. It's roughly the same size as a Fender style fiber board, so I just thought I'd be able to find the right chassis to use, and that's how I ended up with this Hammond chassis here. I think the dimensions on this Hammond chassis are about 13.5 by 5. It's big enough to hold a Champ sized board and also the power transformer that I'm using. So this is the power transformer that came out of the AM/FM radio from the 70s. And it's actually exactly the same dimensions externally as something like a Vibro Champ or even a regular Champ from the 60s and 70s. Once I knew my dimensions of my two largest parts inside this amp, which were the power transformer and the actual fiber board itself, I made a mock-up of the Hammond chassis just to make sure everything would fit. And then I started making mock-ups of the power transformer, the fiber board, and other components inside the amp. And I even took some of the components that I had on hand and just laid them in here directly just to make sure they would fit. And I've gone through a lot of different iterations on this. I went from thinking I was going to use a solid state rectifier to thinking I was going to use a tube rectifier, and then back and forth. And I've gone through a couple different iterations of the actual fiber board. And so even now, as I'm starting to film this series, I'm not exactly sure how this amp's going to turn out. I don't know if the voltage that's going to come out of my power transformer is going to be too high, but I know it's in the ballpark because I have done a little testing up front. But I've spent days upon days poring over a lot of different diagrams and a lot of different schematics that I could have used. I guess we'll just have to see how this thing turns out at the end. So back to the chassis and the board for just a minute. I got these parts from Antique Electronics Supply. They're not a sponsor, but I really like what they have to offer. And they have a lot of hard to find stuff. I had all three of my tube sockets already on hand. I had the jack, the switch, fuse holder. I had harvested an IEC plug from an old computer power supply. I had an old pilot light, and I had a couple of Marshall style input jacks. I even had all the electrolytics already on hand, all the regular capacitors, and all the resistors. So in the end, I ordered some wire from them, I ordered some of the pots, and then really just some odds and ends, especially the wire. Working on guitars most of the time, I tend to keep black, white, and yellow wire around, but some of the other colors and the heater wire I did not have. So as you can see, this chassis is completely blank and it has absolutely no holes in it. I'm gonna have to cut everything from scratch, either drilling or cutting with a Dremel tool or what have you. But at any rate, that's part of the reason why I've really put a lot of time into making sure that all my components fit on paper. There's a couple spots that I'm already concerned about being kind of tight, and it's in between the input jacks and this fiberboard here. So I think what I'll do is mount my front panel controls first, make sure I have enough space for everything to fit in here after. But anyway, let's go ahead and start on modifying the chassis to accept the front controls. So one of the things I've been trying to consider as I've been designing this front panel here is how I'm actually going to cover the face of this amp. I haven't completely decided, but I think I want to try to use a couple pieces of wood here on the sides and kind of, well, I'll show you a picture if I can find one on the web of the style that I'm thinking of. It's kind of Marshall style in a way. But anyway, I wanted some wood to extend about 1 3/4 inches in on each side. And I didn't pick that number out of the air. It just kind of looked right to me. And it was the widest I could get and still fit all my components in the middle here. And even if I don't decide to use wood on each side, it's still going to look pretty good with everything kind of focused here in the center of the panel. So I transferred all my measurements over from my template onto this piece of masking tape here. And using a square, I marked off where the wood would go as far as the trim on each side here. Then I drew a center line all the way down, and I've been measuring out each one of my components and where they fall. And I even took each one of my components and laid them up here physically and just made sure that all those marks look correct. So as they say, here goes nothing. And I've gone ahead and I've punched each one of those locations with a center punch. Now I'm going back with the brad point bit, and I'm starting each one of these with an 1/8 inch hole. Then I'm going to use some of these larger bits to increase the size of each one of those holes. So I don't know if I mentioned it before, but this chassis is steel. Those bits do make quick work of it, but they don't make the cleanest hole in the world, so I'll just clean everything up with a little file. After filing, my pots and everything look like they fit really well. I'm really pleased with how everything turned out. It looks really well spaced. All my little dial indicators fit, and I don't think I mentioned it, but I'm using these little dial covers on each one of the pots. That's what's going to serve as my faceplate for this thing. So volume and all the tone knobs here. All right, so like I said, I got everything mounted in here, but I'm moving on. So we're going to move on to the transformer mounting next. And I've masked this area off, and I've drawn on here the location. It's just a little bit different from my template. I did that intentionally because I thought, well, if I could get away with moving this a little bit towards this pilot light, I would do that because my heater wires on my transformer are really short. And I want to jump them off the pilot light first and not have to figure out how to extend those heater wires or anything like that. I'm going to do most of this work off camera because it's so much cutting, I just don't want to do it on the bench. But anyway, same process, center punch each one of the 4 holes that I'm going to make. Then I'm going to drill 4 holes at the corners of a center section where the bell of the transformer needs to pop through, and I'll cut in between those holes to get the rest of the center section out. All right, the cut for the power supply went pretty well. I've test fitted it, it's mounted on the inside, and I'm moving on to the back panel to cut my power cable connection. I also need to do my fuse, a power switch, and a speaker jack, but I'm still kind of considering the location for each one of those. So I'm going to cut the power jack hole first, and then I'll do the rest. All right, folks, well, I've got the power jack mounted, the power switch mounted, and the fuse holder mounted. I got all those 3 things done because I was able to squeeze them all in over here towards the side. That keeps them away from the tubes and everything else. And I think that's going to help cut down on noise. Next, I've got to figure out mounting locations for the PCB here, and I'm going to have to figure out the mounting locations for each one of my tubes, but we'll work on that one next time. I appreciate y'all hanging out for the start of this build. Be sure to look for the whole series coming up soon. Thanks for all the likes and the comments. Be sure to check my description for all the links for parts and other things in the episode. Thanks for the subscriptions, and I'll see you guys next time.